Good morning and welcome to Redlining's Impact on Environmental Justice. Today, we are going to explore the relationship between historical race-based housing segregation and the current climate crisis. Now, we are very excited to have everyone here today. And we'd also like to remind you, we are in the middle of our campaign for equal dignity, so be sure to check us out there at equaldignity.org. And you can also check out our brand new website, which we have just redesigned and launched. So check that out at civilandhumanrights.org. And just a friendly reminder that all comments of the moderators and guests of our programs represent the thoughts of each individual and do not represent an official position of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Charles Lee. Mr. Lee is the Senior Policy Advisor for Environmental Justice at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and is widely recognized as one of the best in the arena of environmental justice. He is also the principal author of the landmark report, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. He helped to spearhead the emergence of a national environmental justice movement and federal action, including the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, and the National Environment Justice Advisory Council. Charles, I will turn it over to you, and thank you so much for moderating this event.
Thank you, Cam, and thank you to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights for doing this session. It is really great that we're focusing on issues of environmental justice and civil rights and human rights because the intersection is really very huge. So I'm going to say a few words and then briefly kind of introduce the speakers and then get right into the session. I think that one of the most important aspects of environmental justice is the relationship between historical trends and past policy decisions and current disproportionate distribution of current environmental burdens and benefits. And this is something that is just coming to light in terms of research, scholarship, and activism. Our three speakers today have done groundbreaking work in this area to advance this concept and are eminently qualified to speak to it. They are Dr. Vivek Shandas, who's a professor at the Portland State University and co-author of a recent study on redlining and the location of urban heat islands. Next, we have Cate Mingoya, who is the director of capacity building at Groundwork USA. And they are doing some incredible work, working with communities across the country to do research, education, and organizing around the issue. And then thirdly, we have Dr. Robert Nelson. Dr. Nelson is the director of the Digital Scholarship Laboratory at the University of Richmond and co-founder of a really, I think, game-changing project called the Mapping Inequality Project. Our three speakers have different vantage points on this issue. One is a historian, the second is an environmental scientist, and the third is a community activist. The blend of which yields a compelling perspective that may in fact be another game changer in the making. So the way we're going to do this is have a set of questions that hopefully flow in this kind of logic. One is to lay the groundwork in terms of understanding of what this work is. The second is the implications of that work for some current national issues of national interest, and then looking strategically to the future. So let me just start with Dr. Nelson. So Rob, I just want you to talk about what is the Mapping Inequalities Project? Why did you initiate it? And when you talk about this, perhaps you can touch on what is redlining and what was the motivation behind it.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, really a pleasure to be here. This is and be in such a esteemed company of whose people's work I admire just enormously. So let me just give a little bit of brief introduction to the history of redlining and what redlining is. So I hope what you're seeing on your screen is a map that was produced in the late 1930s. This is a map of Atlanta, and this is a color-coded map that was produced by a federal agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Most of you probably are familiar with it, so I won't belabor it. But just to give a kind of very quick and overly simplistic view of redlining. What redlining is the denial of access to capital to certain areas, and based upon usually it's about race. Make it a little overly simplistic, and these are Exhibit A for redlining, where these maps were produced by the federal government in the 1930s, where they color-coded neighborhoods and graded neighborhoods on a scale of A to D. A neighborhoods were deemed, and what they were grading was the mortgage security, which was supposed to provide a kind of shorthand and a straightforward way for both the federal government and for private lenders to know and assess the relative risk of mortgages in particular areas. And so the color scheme that they typically used was A, green, B, blue, C, yellow, and D, red. And the kind of shorthand description, they called A neighborhoods best, B neighborhoods still desirable, C neighborhoods definitely declining, and D neighborhoods hazardous. And so like a kind of straightforward way of thinking about this is think about this like a traffic light. You've got three colors here. A is a traffic light for mortgage lenders and for agencies like the Federal Housing Administration when they're making decisions about things like mortgage guarantees, about how do you make those decisions? What's your decision? Green, A, go. C, yellow, like a stoplight, caution and potentially stop, slow down, think about it. And D is absolutely stop, that these are deemed to be hazardous risks. And they produce these for, I'm showing you one example, but they produce these maps for over 200 cities, and large and small across the US, using a threshold of population of 40,000 or more. So what the mapping inequality, which is a project that collaborators and colleagues of mine and I put together, takes these materials from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, maps them, and makes them interactive. So since I wish we were all in person at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, but I'm going to just use Atlanta as my example. And so this is the whole map for Atlanta, georeferenced over the and georectified over over a digital mapping platform. And I'm going to just kind of change this a little bit and just just so we just see the colors. And I'm going to zoom in to where the museum is, which was in a red line neighborhood. What was a red line neighborhood in the 1930s? I believe the museum is in Pemberton Place, and which was D19 in the 1930s. And just kind of give you just very, very quick look at two concrete examples. So this is what they did for each of these neighborhoods. Is beyond producing the map, they produced what are called area descriptions with these surveys, where they collected a bunch of data about neighborhoods, some of which was quantitative, some of which was qualitative, and much of it was pretty subjective. And one thing they were very interested in was who lived there, and they wanted to know about the infiltration of particularly African Americans, Negro, and immigrants, foreign-born families. And in the case of one thing that was a strike against this area in the 1930s is that it had 15% of its population was African Americans, and they note that as one of the detrimental influences. So they say there's a low-grade white element occupying the southern portion of the area, and here's some of the detrimental influences, 1C. And they also emphasize the mixture of racial groups. So that was definitely something that was at the heart of these grades, was a sense that insistence that the residencies of African Americans and of any people of color and of immigrants was detrimental to the values and suitability of values in a given area. I'm going to give one more quick example. We'll just go just a little bit to the west of where the museum is, at D18. And let's take a look at that area description really quick. Race is a pretty determining factor in these, but it's not the only factor. And since we're talking about the environment, I just wanted to pick out one which kind of shows some of the environmental factors that that were also in play as they were making these grades. And they asked, I'm gonna this is not on the screen, but I'm gonna give you a quote from the instructions that they gave to people who were filling out these forms. And in terms of when they were asking about the detrimental influences, they were really mindful of what Charles called environmental burdens. That was not the language they used in the 1930s, obviously, but they instructed the agents filling these out to mention, I'm quoting, mention such things as obnoxious odors, noises, traffic conditions, fire hazards from certain types of manufacturing plants, such as cleaning plants, refineries, slaughterhouses, disposal, and reclaiming establishments. And so it's not as, one of the things we'll be talking about is the correlation between environmental burdens and exposures and disparities and these redlining grades yesterday and today. And that correlation existed in the 1930s. And one of the things I'm more attuned to because of the work of some of the people I'm on this panel with is that this is not as if there was redlining and that leads to environmental burdens. These things were always mixed up together, as you see from this example. So I'm going to go this quote and then I'm going to stop talking. Detrimental influences. They mention a mixture of racial groups. This is a 70% African American neighborhood, but they also say that the entire area is subject to smoke, dirt, and noise, of network of railroads and industrial enterprises along eastern and northern borders, heavy traffic. And so you immediately see, like, just a few blocks away from the museum, there's a redline neighborhood that was partly redlined. It would have been redlined because it was predominantly African-American, with minimal exceptions. All African-American neighborhoods across the United States were given D grades. But another thing that led to this lower grade for this area is the fact that it had a concentration of industries and portions of the built environment that were pollutants, were represented environmental burdens, and made this place a less desirable place for people to live.
Great. Well, you know, one of the things that Rob's Mapping Inequality project did was to create a resource for others to use. And so building on what Rob said, I wanted to ask Vivek to talk about the relationship between a historical redlining and the current climate crisis, particularly in terms of a phenomenon called urban heat islands. And in that context, Vivek, please talk about your recent study on the subject.
Sure. Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Rob, for setting us up with the most delicious set of data that I've worked with in my entire career. I'm very grateful to you for all the work you did on this, and it really stems from my own interest. To give you a little sense of what we do, we have been driving around and biking around cities all around the country, collecting temperature data, something very straightforward, something relatively easy to do. And we do that in communities where we've been invited to do this, where we have heard an expression of need, and that where we can help a community in their words. And so what we do is provide these little instruments to community-based organizations, often social or environmental justice organizations, that then go and collect hundreds of thousands of temperature readings, temperature and humidity readings. And we've been doing this now for several years, and it's been getting more and more traction over the last few. And one of the things that kept coming up in our results of our mapping efforts is, why do we keep seeing this really consistent pattern of the hottest areas in cities being the places where we have the lowest income communities, the communities that have been historically disinvested? And I started asking scholars around the country about this, and they're saying, well, it doesn't really play out everywhere. It might be very idiosyncratic. And others were saying, well, it's the luxury effect where richer people can spend money on trees and can do things in their neighborhood to reduce the heat generated from the pavement and various other places where the sun's radiation really kind of bakes into the landscape these really hot temperatures. And we were noticing differences sometimes of upwards of 20 degrees Fahrenheit at the same time from one part of the city to the other. And again, scratching our heads, we were thinking, this got to be something, not an individual is trying to reduce heat in their neighborhood, in their household, surrounding the household, the landscaping. There's something beyond the luxury effect. And it was very unsatisfactory at that point. So that's where once Rob and his team had generated this, a colleague of mine, Jeremy Hoffman, who is at the Virginia Science Museum of Virginia in Richmond as well, where a lot of these data were emerging, learned about this and said, hey, there may be something going on here. And it was like a light bulb went off, and we were saying, okay, we don't have 108 cities or 200 plus cities that have been redlined we haven't mapped that many going out and collecting the sensor data. So let's use satellite derived data to look at which areas are hotter and which areas are cooler. And so what we essentially did was take 108 cities and compared these maps from the Mapping Inequality Project, where we could clear, if you would notice from Rob's presentation just now, of the very distinct and very specific boundaries. Like as somebody who does a lot of mapping, the boundaries are very interesting, partly because there's one road that will be left out, and that road, and then the redlining will begin again just a block later. And it's very idiosyncratic how each city has these patterns, and something we're spending the next, I think, probably decade digging into a bit more to understand why that is. And as somebody who's really empirically oriented, I wanted to see what the relationship between these two redlined areas and greenlined areas, and what was going on there in terms of urban heat. So when we brought those data sets together, it was almost uncanny how we could see a very clear pattern across 94% of our cities in the country, where areas that were redlined were consistently hotter than areas that were not redlined. And that was another light bulb went off, and it just was like, oh my goodness, this is a systemic systemically racial policy that has having current day implications on the health and well-being of communities. And we know who are the most detrimentally affected by urban heat, which, by the way, kills more people annually than all other natural hazards, the current pandemic notwithstanding. And so when you get this pernicious killer like urban heat playing out it's a very discriminating natural hazard. And if you have planning policies that have created more highways, more big box stores, more large industrial facilities adjacent to these redlined areas, then we see that heat amplified in those areas. And the communities then are the ones burdened by that heat. And as a result, we can then draw the link to health and human health and well-being, because as the body overheats, it often respiratory illness, there's a lot of respiratory illness. Those who are older, have pre-existing health conditions, or in some way compromised through any form of health related illness, will be the first to die from a heat-related illness. And so we've seen that play out from the health side, and we wanted to just bring up a conversation in this paper that we published earlier this year about why it was that we were seeing this pattern so consistently. And while we don't want to get into causation discussions per se, the correlation was overwhelmingly pointing us in the direction of a federal policy that is really affecting communities today. And in other places, we've also looked at what we call pluvial flooding, which is urban flooding, not riverine flooding, not like rivers breaking their banks, but where lots of water pools in an area of a city. And we're finding very similar patterns where those pluvial flooded areas were also coterminous with the areas that were also the hottest 25% of the neighborhoods in the cities that we looked at. So again, it's just been a really clear indication to us that these policies are having very long-term impacts on health and well-being. And I'm looking forward to the conversation of, that Cate is going to get us into, and like, yes, so what? Let's see what we can do about this now. And so let me pause there and turn it over to you, Charles, to introduce Cate.
Great. Well, you made the segue and set it up really nicely. And of course, Cate is going to talk about, what does one do with it, or what do communities do with this information? And so, Cate, maybe you could kind of give us some background in terms of talking about what is Groundwork USA, and what are you doing to translate this information into community awareness, research, action, and public policy change?
Perfect. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak, and thank you for spending time with us. So Groundwork USA, if you're not familiar with us, check out our website, groundworkusa.org. We're a national network of 21 people-centered environmental justice organizations. So we do a wide variety of work, everything from helping to densify the tree canopy in cities by acting as the urban forester, to taking over contaminated plots of land, also called brownfields, and transforming them into community assets, things like parks, trails, urban farms, community gardens, creative spaces, stuff like that. And we also do climate mitigation work, which is what I'm going to talk about today, related to the fantastic collection of satellite data and digitized redlining maps that everyone on this panel has contributed to today. So generally the work that we've done is through the Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership, pull together 9 of our trusts, 9 of our independent environmental justice organizations, and are looking to explore with residents the relationship between race-based housing segregation and then modern day risk to extreme heat and to flooding. And the punchline of the work that we do with residents is to help them realize that our neighborhoods don't look like this by accident. And that's a really important trigger to being able to get to the next step, which is our neighborhoods aren't going to look any different by accident either. It's going to take really concerted change. So we use these maps and use these visualizations to help people understand the historical connection between policies that happened in the 1930s. And one thing I want to be really clear about that Rob got to is that redlining didn't create segregation. That wasn't the origination of it. There's a really long history and a long relationship between putting people of color and other folks who are lower on America's social caste into these neighborhoods that flood a lot and that are near rail yards and that are near oil refineries. It didn't create it, it just sort of codified it. And that there's this historical relationship with modern day consequences. Then we work with residents to help them understand, so what can we do about it? What are the changes to the built environment that we can make to help make it so that you are safer from extreme heat, that you are not bailing out your basement and having to throw away a lot of your stuff because it's flooding? And how do we understand the systems that have upheld and perpetuated this this longstanding change and this longstanding issue in the built environment? Because some folks ask me, they say, well, the world looks a lot different now than it did in the 1930s when these maps were created. How do you know that it's still an issue that is impacting low-income families and families of color? Well, our communities look really similar now to the way that they did back in the 1930s. About 75% of those neighborhoods that were formerly redlined are still low to moderate income neighborhoods today. So those places that are really hot and are really flooding are really low income and moderate neighborhoods. And about 2/3 of them are majority minority. So we help people to understand the different systems at work. So things like their budgetary cycles or planning processes within their cities, and work with them to figure out how do you intervene in that city so that there's a change in the flow of power. So it's not just folks outside of the community making decisions for the community, but instead residents have a seat at the table so that they're engaging in a more authentic shared leadership and decision-making process. And then organize them so that they can intervene in those systems and advocate for a more equitable distribution of resources. So what flow of money, what flow of programming, what flow of education, what different resources can they get to make their neighborhoods more equitable and to make them safer from the impacts of the climate crisis. And yeah, I'll pause there. I have, I guess, like a quick GIF that I think is, maybe I'll just show that really quickly. I have a really quick GIF that I love to show. Vivek has seen this a number of times, but this is of Elizabeth, New Jersey, which is just south of New York City. And this is the digitized redlining map. Thank you, Rob. That is over the city. And you're going to see green come on the screen. I want you to find any redlined area and keep your eye on it. This is tree canopy cover as of 2016. This is impervious pavement. So think like driveways, parking lots. And this is relative heat, with red being the hottest. Now find any green area on the screen. Doesn't matter the box, just find a green area and keep your eye on it. Tree canopy cover again, impervious pavement again, and then relative heat with that, the reddest areas being the hottest. And generally we see that as you go from A to D, it's hotter, there's more impervious pavement, and there's less tree canopy cover. And we find that residents are really responsive to that, really responsive to seeing those differences, but also members of local government are responsive to it. Elected officials are really responsive to it, because you can't unsee that difference once you see it, and you're kind of forced into a position of having to explain why things still are the way that they are. So I'll stop there, but that's generally what we're doing.
No, that's great, Kate. And, I just want to make sure the audience knows that to go to the Groundwork USA website. They have the most incredible story maps looking at redlining and, different environmental issues related to the climate crisis. There was also recently a New York Times article that focused on this, this whole body of work, that I think everybody here contributed to. So, so let me move on now to looking at some, there's so many implications, but some of the implications. I think Vivek talked about what a remarkable resource that the Mapping Inequality Project created in terms of these shapefiles made available to everyone in the country. So Rob, I just wanted you to focus on COVID-19. What is some of the interests that's being expressed now in looking at the relationship between redlining and the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19? You got to unmute yourself.
Yes. Okay. I'm gonna be really brief about that, but I want to show Kate and Vivek and everybody one thing. I think you're seeing my email, which is kind of odd, but that is intentional. Because of the work that's been on Heat Island, I've been much more tuned to environment and the area descriptions. And one thing we're turning our attention to is taking not just the shape data, the spatial data, but taking the textual data that we have in the area descriptions. And one thing I did, I won't get geeky about this, but I threw it into a classifier. So think like a spam filter. Spam filter's got is trained on a set like this is not spam and this is spam. I have something similar. I have A, B, C, and D. And so I could throw this stuff in, create a trainer, and then look at what are the words that are predictive and associated with each grade. And there's a lot of environmental words in there. And I just want to really briefly show you some of these results. And so these are me just picking out some of the words that struck me as environmental, but A's are woods, B's wooded land, wooded shade, shade trees, wooded area, rolling wooded, well wooded, wooded section. You see wood, hilltop, and then C's you get flat paved, sidewalk paved, gravel, hard land, treeless. So the point, and then let's see, D was you were talking about floods, right? So one of these is flood hazard and low land. The point I make is like, this is again, like not a product of redlining. This is baked in at the time that, and the tree canopy was something they were thinking about. Impervious surfaces, they were talking about them in those terms, but they were talking about pavement a lot. And the word pavement would be really predictive of a yellow lined or or a redlined area. So now I will stop sharing and actually answer the question. And I'll be really super brief about it. So
No, that was great.
Yes, there are definitely correlations. And one thing I'd point out is a report that was produced by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and I'll throw this into the chat, the URL, where we don't have great spatially specific granular data for COVID-19 yet, but we have a lot of data about other health conditions. And the redlining correlates from the 1930s, really correlates with high asthma rates, with high mental illness rates, kidney disease, pulmonary disease, and life expectancy. So Vivek, like, I think you guys usually see like 15 to 20 degrees difference between green-lined areas and red-lined areas. You see almost the same number, right? But in terms of life expectancy, 15 to 20-year life expectancy difference between some of these green-lined areas and some of these red-lined areas. And that is really very much a product of, I mean, social stressors, obviously, but those social stressors have like a marked influence on disease prevalence. And you know, COVID-19 is obviously the latest manifestation of that, but we see it in everything with the exception of cancer, because you have to live long enough. You have to have, you know, cancer is almost like it's oppositely correlated with everything else, because if you die of asthma or you know, poor mental health or kidney disease, you don't often live long enough to contract cancer. So that's actually the one that's inversely proportional to the grades. Great,
thanks, Rob. So, you know, just expanding on that, Vivek, you know, to talk, I want to kind of expand into looking at other environmental issues besides urban heat islands that have some roots in redlining. So can you talk to that? I mean, this is all part of your work to achieve sustainable communities.
Sure. Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Cate. Part of what I'd like to at least get into a little bit in this conversation is the direct effects that we can see and we can empirically document, and that Rob was suggesting in terms of health impacts. And we were talking about flood, and we can talk about food deserts being another set, industrial pollutants being another, and these kind of compounding and even cascading effects, whether it be seasonal as episodic events of flood and heat occur, or as continuous over time where industrial pollutants are generated. We've looked at several cities and looked to see where the top 10 industrial polluters are in these cities in relation to redline. And almost in every case, the top 10 industrial polluters are within 2 kilometers of these redlined areas in many cities that we've looked at. And we're publishing on that coming up soon here. But I wanted to just maybe spend a moment on this question of the urban development process, because I think that's what really underlies a lot of this. And the fact that right now we're seeing cities really budgets cratering in terms of the ability to really address some of the social service needs and other challenges that our communities are facing. And part of that really comes back to the fact that even during the redline time, our urban development and the systems that were created as cities were emerging as very important players on the landscape back in the late 1800s into the 1900s, like the systems that we created haven't changed a great deal, I would argue, even today. And one simple example of that is the fact that, as I was saying, the budgets for cities have become so thin that often development processes and private industry really holds many cities, in many cases, hostage to jobs and to industrial development, such that a city is saying, yes, yes, please come. We will do anything for you. We will give you tax breaks. We will do whatever it takes to get you here, and you can go wherever you'd like. And so cities really, in many ways, are beholden to a very aggressive and often well planned out, decades in advance in some cases, development process in cities. And that in turn can really affect where a new development goes, what the review process looks like, and then who is ultimately burdened by that. And whether you look at the federal freeway system from the 1950s, those often going into the lowest cost areas of cities, right? So you have a very low cost rent, at least land cost area of cities, and that was intentionally created by disinvestment through redlining and other covenants that were set up. Then you have big projects like freeways coming in the 50s saying, okay, where do we go? Well, we're going to go where it's cheap. And where is it cheap? The places we've disinvested. And just like that, we see all of the large scale industries with huge amounts of asphalt and going into these locations. And that said, I would also want to just add a quick point here in that we are developing, the way we're developing and the kind of conditions within which we're developing are becoming much more, are likely to amplify temperature and likely to amplify heat. Because in many cases, what we're doing still is the same kind of development we did in the 1950s, where we're rezoning a specific parcel of land, we're clearing the land and then trying to build that parcel out to its corners as much as we can so that we have more square footage in that area, and that can increase rents that the property owner or manager will be able to access. And so what we see now is these kinds of development that are filling up the spaces and often very similar to what we've done in the past without really thinking about what are the opportunities for bringing in other potentially heat mitigating strategies in these development processes. So I would just say we're up against a whole lot of capital, a whole lot of planning, and a whole lot of really well orchestrated systems that are likely amplifying temperatures as we're seeing cities change and develop more. So not to be the poo-pooer and bringing the dark cloud over this, but I do think that this work is bringing up so many other environmental issues that are embedded, not necessarily with an individual developer or an individual person. It's really embedded within a system that is almost designed to develop in the way that we're developing in our cities. And so I want to leave it at that and just kind of maybe think about ways in which this can be addressed.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think you know, there's probably a dozen webinars that can be done on this subject as a overall. But let me go to Cate, and I want to step back a little bit and kind of dissect this process a little bit. And you know, one of the really interesting aspects of this work that I've found in my looking at it is the way that communities have been involved in actually doing the research on redlining and climate conditions. And so, Cate, can you talk about that and talk about how that has led to more active or more effective public policy advocacy, and maybe even give some examples of the kind of you know, accomplishments kind of that's been achieved through this kind of work?
Yeah, sure thing. It was really hard for me to not yell out like "preach" when Vivek was talking about that, because this is really big. This is really systemic. It's not by accident. It's intentional. And the time has passed for us to pretend that it's an accident. The time has passed for us to pretend that it's not going to require coordinated action to start intervening and breaking into these systems. Like we're here. We're in this together. And before I sort of jump into the way that residents are working on this, I do see this type of work as a type of reparations work. And I know that people can get a little bit uncomfortable with the phrasing of that, but I encourage you to sort of step out of your comfort zone and take a really big vision about what it means to repair harm, which is at the heart of reparations work. And I think that the maps that have been created or that have been digitized and the data that's been collected gives us an opportunity to expose harm and then come to a collective understanding of our responsibility as members of the same community. One of the things that I did not expect as a result of this work was that folks are able to depersonalize some of these systemic issues, which is really powerful to getting people on board together. Our country is not great at talking about race. It's not great at talking about class, but these redlining maps allow people to depersonalize and understand that the challenges we're facing are a systemic issue. And even if you don't live in that neighborhood, like that's going to trickle out to you and impact you in some way, shape, or form. So people who don't believe in the climate crisis, people who don't believe in systemic racism have come on board and have had aha changing moments. And that's everyone from the mayor of cities where people were not allowed to say the R word, racism, within the halls of that government body. Seeing these maps, holding on to the documents that we've been produced and have brought residents to city council meetings and to the mayor's office to chat about has changed minds and hearts. And I actually did not think that that was possible. And I would have called you a liar if you told me that it was possible through this project. So working closely with residents and that data, we've a big part of our work is to help build the capacity of residents to self-advocate. We would love to put ourselves out of business, and we believe that if it's related to the heat island effect or maternal mortality or to asthma rates, it's really important that residents have the power to make their own seat at the table or open up that folding chair at the table to intervene in systems of power. So the maps that we've produced, which have been both in physical copies and in this digital portal, which you can play with on our website, I encourage you to check out our website, groundworkusa.org. It allows residents to dig into the data and to demystify what it looks like. So I'll give you two examples. One of my favorite is residents in Globeville, which is a former site of a former lead smelting plant. The entire neighborhood is a Superfund site. It's got a lot of environmental justice issues, predominantly Latinx population. Residents were digging into those online maps, and it was the residents who identified, gosh, we've only got 1% tree canopy cover in our neighborhood, which is a formerly red line neighborhood. But if you take a bus line across town to a formerly green line neighborhood, they've got 24% tree canopy cover. And that helped residents to come up with a really concrete ask of their local government. We want 10,000 trees planted in 10 years. Right now, the city's come back and they said, how about 3,000? So the neighborhood's still in negotiations with the city about what that's gonna look like. But they've got 3,000 trees. We've got 100 something in the ground already from the city. Another example is getting youth involved to understand the heat island effect a little bit better. So there are these really cool little attachments that you can add to your phone or to your iPad, and it allows you to understand like which areas are hot versus which areas are cool, just through looking through the little camera. So sending youth out to identify which areas do we kind of know are hot through our lived experience, but really want to put data to that, and sending youth out into the community to sort of better understand that. And then I think another important point to note is you might be sitting here and saying, gosh, my community did not have a redlining map. What does that mean? If you live in a community that was not formally redlined, your community is not off the hook from race-based federal interventions. One example of that is Richmond, California, which was too small in the 1930s to warrant an HOLC map, but had a lot of federal intervention in terms of their housing. It was the site. It is currently the site of a refinery, shipyards, and a lot of petrochemical rail lines that bring gas into the country. And the federal government spent quite a bit of money during the war period building up housing there for residents. And you can read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, where he gets into a little bit more detail about this. But the instructions for building those homes had that the Black homes had to be built sandwiched between the refinery and then the two petrochemical rail yards. So there is, I guarantee you, if your city existed during that time, there's probably some sort of a federal intervention that has led to long-term health consequences and long-term environmental consequences. So being able to dig into and demystify this data gives residents the ability to come up with really concrete asks, and also allows them to go out and have conversations in their community with really tangible images. And the last thing I'll say is I think that people respond with their heart. We talk a lot about data. Let me explain that, that I often think about like the ghost of Al Gore saying, 2.5 degrees centigrade. People know numbers, but they don't always get numbers, but people really get images. And seeing the difference between the northern part of Elizabeth, New Jersey, which has the majority of Latinx or really high percentages of Latinx residents, but no trees. People see and respond to that difference. In Richmond, why is the northeastern part of this city so dark red in terms of heat vulnerability? And in the southern part of the river, a little not so red. and people really respond to that difference in a way that stirs their heart and keeps them invested for the long haul. And systemic things are not going to be changed in a day. This is a multi-generational work. I'm not going to live to see the end of it. So keeping people invested in the long haul is a really big priority. These images allow us to do that in a way that I think was not possible a couple of years ago.
Wow, thank you. You know, one thing I just want to make a plug for, in addition to Cate's plug for Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, is a video that Richard Rothstein, I think, co-produced and narrates called Segregated by Design. And you can just Google that and you can find that. And that's a really powerful, compelling video. So there were some other questions, but I think I'm going to stop a little bit right now. And see if I can get some Q's and A's. I got one from the audience here that basically says, how do you see the relatively recent building of large housing developments in the center of cities affecting the trends being discussed here? And I guess, you know, everybody should take a quick shot at this because I think everybody has a different perspective on it. Rob, did you want to start?
Sure. We'll start with the person who has the least expertise to address this question. So I'll be really brief. I mean, I'm curious actually. This is kind of building on this question and asking another one for Cate and Vivek. It does seem to me that there's real challenges around this. One of the challenges is you make places, these formerly redlined areas, more livable. You potentially make them more attractive as places for gentrification, say, and it seems to me like striking the balance between having affordable housing, and some of that affordable housing involves kind of density we're talking about here, and that kind of density often produces the kind of heat island effects that Vivek is talking about. We obviously need affordable housing, and balancing that with attention to the environment and attention to green space, but not making those places again, like being mindful that they can be changed in a way that makes them attractive to speculators, attractive to gentrification, which you know, undermines that effort to improve the lives of people who are living there. You know, displacing them, making it unaffordable for them to live in their own neighborhoods is not a good solution to these. These are really complicated problems that I'm sure Cate and Vivek will tell us the solutions to.
Great. Vivek, you want to just add a few thoughts to that? Yeah,
so there's some also questions about the topic of gentrification that Rob brought up, and I'm seeing some chat on that as well. What we did a quick study to look at these redlined areas in population change from 1980 to 2016, and we wanted to see where were places in terms of census data, which grades were these A, B, C, D grades, which grades were actually seeing population changes in the time where we could actually systematically evaluate trends over time. And when we looked across the country, again, very similar patterns were emerging in that the D areas by and far were the fastest in population growth that were happening in any city that we looked at. A areas were the least in terms of population growth consistently across every city. And what that's really got us thinking about is this notion of permissive landscapes, as redlined areas have always been. The things that don't want to be put in my backyard, such as a lot of high density homes, those get pushed still today. Up until 2016, we're talking about just a few years ago, those get pushed into these historically, what we're calling permissive spaces, where it's like there's so much, the fact that Cate was bringing up that majority of the populations that are living in the areas, the historically redlined areas, are still having this intergenerational experience of living in those areas. We're finding that these areas still are kind of almost like a gravity model. You're pulling all those lesser desirable land uses often still into the redlined areas. And that system, as I keep going back to, has not changed.
Great. Kate, I know you got lots to say about this.
I do. I'll put on my housing hat and climate hat at the same time. I don't think we can talk realistically about gentrification and displacement issues and a future where that does not push people out, does not break up communities unless we start talking about the decommodification of land. I think that a lot of the sort of like little 1% solutions and tweaks that we think about in order to get people to be able to stay in their community still disproportionately ends up benefiting people who have taken advantage of those lowered land prices, people who take advantage of population by charging high rents. And it's just sort of this like trickle down solution. The people who have lived in these red line neighborhoods have not only shouldered the burden of disproportionately hot and wet places, but we got to think about like within a city, sort of where do the factories end up and where do the warehouses end up and where does the garbage get dumped? And so those folks have for a really long time shouldered disproportionately the burden of what makes the more affluent parts of the city so nice and so livable and so green and so bucolic in some ways. And so that there's been a really, really long history of that. So it's not surprising that once those areas are seen as an opportunity for development, that those folks continue to shoulder that burden by getting booted out of their social safety nets into outlining areas. I don't necessarily think that the building of housing is necessarily a bad thing. So just like the building of those large buildings does not give me pause. We do need more housing. We're in a housing crisis that's actually really similar to what we were dealing with right before and during the Great Depression. We just need people to actually have access to that housing so they can stay in their communities. Part of that is rethinking whether or not land should be commodified at all, and if we should be taking some of the money that we're investing into cities and investing it into community land banks and land trusts. I'm also thinking about whether or not folks need the rates of return that they do need on their properties. I live in Boston, which sees just exceptionally like 20% increases sometimes in neighborhoods year over year on those housing values. You actually didn't earn that. You don't actually need that money for your property. You have not improved it enough to sort of warrant that. And those kind of we need to think about this holistically, not just, gosh, we want to keep buildings out so that the temperature stays down, but we want to keep the temperature down, but we want the people who live in these neighborhoods to be able to stay and to benefit from their hard work and to benefit from the hard work of activists that are just trying to make it a nicer environment. So it would be really nice if we could just sort of focus really narrowly in on climate crisis issues, but it's going to have to come with right to the city issues. It's going to have to come with housing issues. It's going to have to come with a reframing of the right to the city and who we think has a right to the social and financial benefits of the land in our city. So it's a really big and sticky consequence, but one of the things that in the Groundwork network that we do is we don't view it in isolation. So yes, we are an environmental justice focused nonprofit, but we also work really closely with anti-gentrification and displacement groups so that when we're building a park or we're building densifying the urban tree canopy, we're consulting with people whose bread and butter is trying to prevent some of these things and making sure that the residents have a seat at the table. Are we big enough to sort of hold back this tidal wave by ourselves? Absolutely not. That's where you folks come in. Even just being here, learning about these issues is making a big step towards helping to keep people a little bit safer and a little bit more secure in their environment.
I just a little historical addendum to that. I love that decommodification of land, and I kind of demonstrated just really briefly that classification, text classification work, and at the top for D neighborhoods are things like difficulty collections and rental collections. And for me, what that's brought home is something I think I already knew, is that we think of redlined areas as places of divestment, but they're also places of investment. They are places where there's a lot of money. It's just not investment in the people who live there. It's investment by slumlords. I mean, that is the way we would have put it in the 1930s. These were places where it's not just about denying these areas access to capital through mortgages. It's about actively extracting the capital that is produced in them and that people have in their pockets in those areas through the forms of these kind of parasitic rental values. So this is, again, like what you're saying is as beautifully put, because I think you see that too. If you just start to scratch the surface of this archive, you see exactly that phenomena as well.
Wonderful. Wow, that's like I said, this could be several webinars on different aspects of this issue. There's one more question I think I can hand off, which is a very practical question. How can we request that this panel speak to our association, which is the Atlanta Realtors Association, especially with your talking points about Atlanta? And I guess, you know, we can refer that to the sponsors of this webinar, the Center for Civil and Human Rights. And I'm sure they'll be willing to comply with that request. So I think it is time to start bringing this to a close. I have several other questions, but I think, you know, there's like I said, more definitely a need for more conversation. And I just want to conclude by thanking our three presenters and all of you who participated in this webinar. And I just want to reiterate the point I made at the beginning, and I think you saw this, the synergy of these three perspectives, you know, is a blend that is, you know, really compelling, and is truly, and may in fact be another game changer in the making. We are starting to deal with a set of issues that are, I think, really gets to the heart of what environmental justice is all about. So with that, Kara or Cam, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. And of course, to our audience, this was an amazing discussion and I truly enjoyed it. We also want to make sure that our audience can connect with the work that is going on. So with our weekly action checklist, number one, follow Groundwork USA on social at Groundwork USA. Number two, learn how groundwork communities are using maps and data to build resilience to extreme heat and flooding. And we've got the site right there that you can go to, and also explore the Mapping Inequality Project. And we have the website there as well. Once again, thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you, Charles, for moderating. Thank you to our panelists, and we hope to see you at the center soon. Have a wonderful day.